Hello everyone, I'm Devika. I'm a postdoc research associate in the School of English at Newcastle University, and I'm very happy to share my research through this presentation where I'm exploring the city in Black British children's literature and the representation of the city along with the representation of children who have migrated to England to be with their parents in this particular genre of literature. Various scholars have argued that children are shaped as much by the social world as by their physical world. Spaces and places have an importance in their everyday lives and experiences. So, to quote Tribunella, Freeman, Carroll, Goga, the city becomes a very important setting in contemporary children's literature, and children's writers have increasingly embraced realism, which brings with it a focus on class struggle, psychological complexity, issues of race, and urban life. The city that can serve as a space where different cultures can coexist transforms into a space where migrant experiences are fraught with challenges. Often, as Doughty and Thompson note, leaving home is not a choice that the child gets to make, especially in the case of children's migration and settlement. So the relationship to place and space becomes even more complicated. So which land is home, the one that they have left behind or the one that they are inhabiting now? At the same time, they also have to negotiate cultural differences and often face racial discrimination. So how do children and young people who migrate to a new city, such as London from Jamaica or Guyana, experience London as a key urban setting in their new lives? How do they grapple with and reconcile with the idea of home and belonging in this new urban space, London? In a 1990 article, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors, Bishop emphasizes that the lack of diversity creates a cycle of skewed and faulty representations and mirrors similar experiences as universal while excluding others and never working as windows or doors to other cultures. Keeping that in mind, this research focuses on primarily the experiences of Black British children and Black British children's literature. This has wide-ranging effects on key issues central to childhood, children's identity, cultural heritage, diverse childhood experiences, feeling of belonging, inclusion, and alienation. This presentation seeks to explore Leslie in London by Grace Nichols and Surprising Joy by Valerie Bloom to analyze how migrant children construct and experience the city, their Caribbean cultural heritage, as well as their Black British identity. It is an investigation of the representation of the city for the migrant child in Black British children's literature. Through this analysis, supplemented by Grace Nichols and Valerie Bloom's archives, held at Seven Stories, the National Center for the Children's Book in the UK, the paper attempts to show the intertwining of place and identity in these two novels, the relationship of the child to the world outside and the world within, and highlight the politics of language, the act of reclaiming one's identity and cultural heritage through food, and the role of memory in negotiating with the Caribbean consciousness in Black British literature. These two novels are particularly important for they represent the experiences of two Black British children and their relationship with the city and its microspaces, such as the school, the neighborhood, the market, the local train station, the underground. And as Ramadarshan Bol notes, in inclusive young adult fiction, authors of color in the United Kingdom, the book publishing industry is reproducing and perpetuating cultural hierarchies, and in this case, racial and ethnic ones. And it is important to examine the experiences of own voice cultural producers that create a counter narrative, and to use Delgado's term, counter narratives offer a voice and a space for marginalized groups to be heard and understood. Similar novels that focus on the experiences of children migrating to a new country, and as has been sometimes termed by Sansa Connor, migration stories have been published since the 1980s. These include Grace Nichols' Leslie in London, 1984, Kate Elizabeth Hope leave Jamaica, and Birds in the Wilderness in the 1990s, Florilla Benjamin's Coming to England in the 1990s, and Valerie Bloom's Surprising Joy. They all detail female migrations from the West Indies to England. According to Sansa Connor, the central character is not only transitioning between nations, but between usually a rural life with loving grandparents to an urban life with often hostile or work-weary parents the child character regards as strangers. The girls in these stories are frequently coming of age, but the departure from childhood mandates the recognition of the tenuousness of growing up Black in Britain, as Sansa Connor has explored in Soon Come to This Island. Leslie and Joy grapple with similar changes in place, home, even in the move from the rural to the urban space while confronting racism, alienation, and isolation. Through their exploration within these new spaces in London, England, they try to construct and sometimes transform their identity as well as the idea of home. In identity plays space in children's and young adult literature. The spaces that children characters inhabit in literature, the ways in which they come to know and inhabit them, affect them profoundly and in many different ways. These stories often help situate and shape the children who read them. Keeping that in mind, the first experiences of London for both Joy and Leslie are mediated by the contrast in weather in Guyana and Jamaica and England, with the warm tropical weather at the home they have left behind, and in Leslie's words, the cold, smoky grey morning in London. Joy longs to be in the sun, but is met with and is wary of the cold sunshine. The first experiences reflect inquisitiveness combined with the comparison with their old home and a longing for the past that they can no longer visit. Both Leslie and Joy on the first arrival attempt to explore this new city and its spaces. They deal and confront racism, experience isolation, and long to go back to what they consider home. Joy is unable to go back to and is unable to understand the landscape of the city and wonders what kills the tree then when she finds no leaves on any of the trees in her neighborhood. In one of the draft versions in Bloom's archives, Bloom captures a child's perspective of a completely new city. Joy is puzzled. All the houses look the same, all the trees dead, she wonders. Leslie likewise is unable to understand why we had to come to this country anyway. And after she is unable to find any friends in the neighborhood and she faces racial discrimination in her school. Joy, due to her fraught situation at home with Sophie, her mother, and the racism that she faces at school, secretly sells food at school to earn enough money to return to Jamaica. Nichols wrote multiple drafts of the sections on school, and each section tries to capture Leslie's fledgling connection to the city via the school and the neighborhood. While the draft versions of and Notes on Surprising Joy found in Bloom's archives focus equally on the racism faced by Joy at school and her relationship with her mother, the sections on school are never included in the final book version. These sections on the school and neighborhood highlight their nervousness, enhance the lived experiences of both Leslie and Joy, their loneliness, and their longing for a sense of belonging. School and the neighborhood become the first public microspaces through which they experience the city. Yet here, not only do they confront racism, they finally and eventually find ways to cope with it. They both choose different ways to cope with this form of racism and discrimination. Leslie chooses to assimilate and not share her cultural heritage with others when they make fun of her food, language, and her heritage. She refuses to tell her friends about Mashramani, a Guyanese festival, instead decides to celebrate that festival lunchbox night in hope of being included. She relies on the tamarind seed sent by her grandmother to magically solve her problems, isolation, and help her find friends. Nichols, in this case, opts for a more hopeful and optimistic tone in the novel. As Sansa Connor points out, Nichols Leslie manages to stay optimistic about her adopted country, despite the fact that Nichols wrote the book following the series of race riots in 1981 and the subsequent push for multicultural and anti-racist education. However, she elaborates, 10 years after the Stephen Lawrence murder, the case is very much different, and this is evident in Bloom's surprising joy and how Joy faces racial discrimination in her everyday experiences. Joy refuses to forget her culture and heritage by refusing to conform and uses the past experiences and knowledge that she gained at her old home in Jamaica to guide her through the new home in London. Joy learns different, more public strategies for fighting racism. And to quote Sansa Connor, uses cooking not only as a way of privately connecting with her West Indian heritage, but as a way of making friends with her non-West Indian classmates. She criticizes her mother Sophie for having forgotten all her Jamaican background and offers to teach her how to cook West Indian style. Unlike all other and earlier stories where fighting and assimilating were the weapons of survival, Joy learns very different messages of pride in language, heritage, and non-violence. Guga and Kamaling Maibauer discuss in Maps and Mapping in Children's Literature the interaction between children and the way their general mapping capacities develop with their growing ability to navigate an urban space or a rural space. And this is seen in the interaction of both Leslie and Joy. Moving through this urban space for them comes with the difficulties. They are unable to reconcile their neighborhood with the familiar and often rich and natural environment that they were used to before they moved to London, where in their old home they could run down to the beach or to the forest and were in a more open space. Here they're restricted to smaller homes and enclosed private domains. In this extract from one of Nichols's notes on Leslie in London in her archives, Leslie goes on the London Underground for the first time. This passage gives us a child's perspective of everyday encounters in the London Underground. Leslie, who had never been on the Underground before or had never been on an escalator either, gasped in surprise when they came to the long moving shiny stairs. As they went down, other people were coming up on another one, and she thought that the escalators looked like moving slides with steps on them as she watched the heads of people gliding in and out of the ground. The passage encapsulated both her nervousness and her curiosity, her fear and her apprehension of experiencing this new side of the city. As Morgan explains, the peril and danger of an alien environment present the protagonist with a unique challenge to relinquish childlike dependencies, master obstacles, and emerge victorious. In a similar fashion, both Leslie and Joy find an inner potential to face and confront these difficulties and challenges. The same spaces often have different impact on different children, and maybe in some instances, the same spaces are experienced differently by children and adults living together. For instance, Leslie and Joy face isolation and racial discrimination at their schools, even though other children are much more comfortable and thriving in that same space. Similarly, Joy continues to feel strange and homesick at her home in England, unlike her mother Sophie, who is completely at ease in that home, and as Joy wonders, seems to be at a complete disconnect with her own life in Jamaica and her childhood. So interestingly, it is the market that facilitates their first acceptance of London as a home for the first time. Both Leslie and Joy feel closer to home when they go to the local market that sells food and objects similar to what they get in Guyana and Jamaica. These markets encapsulate the spirit of the markets that Leslie and Joy are familiar with. It helps them find a tangible connection to the home that they feel they seem to have left behind and lost. In this passage, Leslie visits this shepherd's bush market, hears the calypso music, and sees the fruits. Shepherd's Bush Market is a big market in West London that has been going on since 1914. Leslie felt good to see her mother cheerful again. The market reminded Leslie of home. She could see mangoes, even though they were a bit wrinkled. She could see dried coconuts, plantains, and sugarcane. They bought some plantains and saltfish, which her father loved, and they bought a red, gold, and rasta beret. In Nichols' editorial correspondence, there is a suggestion of focusing on this shopping expedition as a way of representing the unself-conscious child who responds positively to the strange new world around her. This is in line with the overall optimistic and hopeful tone that can be found in Leslie in London. However, the market still plays a role in enabling Leslie and Joy to respond differently to the new city, London, that they now call home. It brings them closer as a family in their own homes and find a way to maintain a connection with the places and the homes that they have moved away from. Leslie, through the music, food, and other objects in the market, is able to connect with her home, culture, heritage, and feel that she belonged. Joy uses the food and produce she buys from the market to maintain her connection with the home she has left behind, her grandmother, and her friends. She uses it as a means to empower herself and celebrate her culture and heritage, and also as a way to mend her relationship with her mother, Sophie. There is a constant negotiation between sameness and difference along this spatial axis of home in the past and home in the present. These negotiations reflect upon the interconnectedness between childhood, place, home, and belonging with respect to the underlying differences, racism, alienation, assimilation, and cultural heritage. The changing socio-spatial organization, as Holloway points out, impacts upon children's identity. And through the microspaces of the city that they now inhabit, be it home, school, neighborhood, or the market, Joy and Leslie address racism and create a space for themselves within the new city, London, as well as a new home. While Leslie mediates her interactions in the city by resorting to assimilation and the magic of her tamarind seed, Joy confronts racism head on, refuses to conform, and chooses to celebrate her culture and heritage in finding her own place in this city. Thank you.